Hey there, and welcome to another episode of the Virtual CISO Podcast. As always, I'm your host, John Berry, and with me, as always, the butthead to my Beavis, Jeremy Sporn. Hey, Jeremy.
Butthead may be the kindest way you have addressed me all week, so I'll take this as a victory so far.
As they say, if the shoe fits.
There it is.
Did you get a chance to catch my conversation with Andrew? I don't know why I always ask you that because I always know you did, but either way, let's go with it.
One of these days I'll just say no and we'll have nothing else to talk about. Yes, and despite the fact you struggled to remember to record yet another conversation, you and Andrew did cover some really good ground. I mean, Andrew is an absolute beast in the application security industry. You know, he's contributed to a number of OWASP projects, OWASP Top 10, the ASVS, and even the IoT Top 10. He, like everyone at OWASP, it seems, is just a phenomenal communicator. His explanation of the OWASP Top 10, that it's an awareness document, not a standard. First time I've ever heard it explained that way. Really makes a lot of sense now that I've heard it put, just in those words.
Yeah, it's funny. I've used the OWASP Top 10 for 15 years probably, and my favorite part of the conversation is when he referred to it, the OWASP Top 10 as being about the not to do, and the ASVS is about the what to do, which I thought was just such a very simple but very powerful perspective. Anything else you want to highlight before we get to the conversation?
Yes. And I'll always say yes to that question as well, John, just so everyone. Expect to walk away with a very clear understanding of how to use the OWASP Top 10, especially versus the ASVS. And if you're that business or technology leader who really needs to speak that application security language to your development team, this episode will really help you get on that same page with them.
Yeah, absolutely agreed. No further ado, let's get to the show. Andrew, thank you for joining me again for the second recording of the podcast. Unfortunately, the first recording, I never hit record. How are you today?
I'm really good. I'm glad the first one wasn't recorded. I slammed so many people. I'm joking.
I won't tell any of the other members of the OWASP Top 10 or even the other efforts what bad things you said about their projects. So this is going to give you a chance to clean that all up. You can't make things up. All right, so let's start easy. And you should be good at this because you've already had the opportunity to answer this question. Can you tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do?
I'm Andrew Vanderstock. I've been participating in OWASP since 2002. I wasn't there at the very beginning, but I do know who was there. So it's always an interesting conversation with who claim to be there. I've been doing the OWASP developer guide back in the early 2000s. The application security verification since 2009, and of course the OWASP Top 10. I did the 2007 version and the 2017 version, and we're working on the 2020 version right now.
Gotcha. And I've had Daniel on to talk about the ASVS, and from our preliminary conversation, I'm a huge OWASP fan.
Mm-hmm.
Really love the effort, and thank you for coming on, and thank you for your work on the OWASP Top 10. I think it's one of the best forms of guidance in the world on any topic around information security.
No worries, thank you.
So before we get serious, before we get down to business, we have a tradition here to ask, what's your drink of choice?
Well, in the mornings, it's espresso, and I'm a bit of a coffee snob. Come from Australia, so our coffee culture comes from Italy, and therefore I only consider coffee from Italy and some other places and Australia to be of the sufficient quality, so I do it myself. But after hours, it's beer, and my favorite tipple is actually IPAs, but I've always drunk pale ales. My first drink was actually Cooper's Pale Ale, which is brewed in bottles, so the yeast is actually in there, so it's actually a cloudy beer. Mm-hmm. And it's delicious. I love it.
So it's almost like an IPA Weiss, you get the Weiss beers that also have the yeast that's still in there. Same thing with a pale ale?
I must admit I've never had a wheat beer with
like
the yeast
or
in
Belgian. You know how the Belgians tend to have a lot of yeast in the bottle? Same concept.
Same concept.
Yeah, and just out of curiosity, this Cooper's. I thought being from Australia, you were going to say Foster's, but you already corrected me in our last podcast.
No, we don't drink that.
That's just marketing, huh? That's
Yeah.
just Crocodile Dundee stuff.
Yeah, it's barely brewed in Australia. It's mostly brewed overseas. I don't know anyone who actually drinks it in Australia. It's difficult to get in many of the bottle shops. You can get it, but it's not popular. Each state in Australia actually has its own beer culture, and they prefer their own things. So it's sort of surprising to some of my friends that I got into Cooper's because it's a South Australian beer. Mm-hmm. Most people in your own state get on things like, in my state, Victoria, it would have been Victoria Bitter. And that's the beer you buy and put in the bath in parties that no one drinks. So it's cheap. It's actually not bad, but it's also the beer that no one really wants because they want the fancier beers. I personally prefer the Coopers, or in America I go for the craft beers. This one's Voodoo Ranger. It's actually very hoppy, and that's what I like. I don't really like wheat beers. I like the hoppiness of IPAs.
Gotcha. And can you get Cooper in Cooper's? Is it here in Australia? Excuse me, here in America?
I'm sure you can, but I haven't tried.
I gotcha.
In Colorado, it's a little bit tricky. The supermarkets don't tend to sell anything other than just standard beers, and mm-hmm. the bottle shops around here tend to be a bit small. In Australia, bottle shops are huge. Like, think Lowe's or one of those other big barn type places, and then put alcohol in it. That's an Australian bottle shop.
Well, so good news. Come to New Jersey. We have those, and I'll get you any beer you want. And then real quick for you on the espresso. Are you a Lavaz person or an Illy person?
Illy.
And why? And why?
Illy, because they actually train their baristas. They're actually baristas. They're not just people with the title barista. They actually know what they're doing with the bean. Because I drink espresso, there's absolutely nowhere to hide. If it's a bad draw, it's literally going to be a terrible coffee. Mm-hmm. And so if people, funny story, when I was in Tasmania, they had a new cafe owner, and she'd only been open for a couple of weeks, and she didn't know how to make a long black, which is a double espresso with a little bit of shorter. It's not an Americano, it's a little shorter than that. And so I ended up having to show her how to use her equipment to make a proper long black. So if you go to Australia, flat whites, long blacks, it's a bit of a strange title, but in Italian, it's a lungio or a long. And so that's what it comes from. That's our culture.
So it's funny, my daughter likes flat white, iced flat whites. So yeah, so that one, well, listen, she's young. I mean, yeah, she'll grow up. And then real quick for you on the, do you brew your own every day? Do you have an espresso machine in the house?
I do.
Gotcha.
Yes. No, just getting the quality of coffee from the local supermarket is very difficult. Getting the grind is difficult, and so it's better to just simply have your own machine and be able to be in control of that.
Excellent. All right, so let's get down to business. So what is the OWASP Top 10?
I just had to show you. Coffee.
What is that? Oh, that's your coffee?
Espresso cup. That's an espresso cup. Actually, one of the larger ones.
No, come on. You're supposed to have the little one with the. I mean, if you like Italian, I was kind of funny. Like going to Italy, you go into like a gas station, and they serve you it, with the Lavazza, the Illy cup, and the saucer, and it's awesome. It is awesome. And after being in Italy, I drink a little bit more than I used to. All right. So getting back to both wine and espresso. So getting back to the, what is the OWASP Top 10?
The OWASP Top 10, from our perspective, is an awareness document. It's the things that you need to know to avoid being hacked. It was designed primarily to provide some sort of awareness to security professionals and developers. Our primary audience is developers, but they may not necessarily be aware of it. But because it's got literally a 15+ year history, the developers in the beginning never knew anything about it. So we had to work with application security teams to bring it in. Our goal is to give people who are starting out on their application security journey the rough map. Like, here's New York, here's Atlanta. It's not to, here is like Queens, and here is the Bronx, and here is some other place in New York that I don't know. But fundamentally, we're not trying to give people every answer. We're trying to give them, these are the places you're most likely to get mugged in. So,
so it's you know what, I've never heard it referred to that way. So it's an application mugging. All right, I'm with you. So I've always so I apologize. You're the project lead, so I can't disagree with it, but I always considered the gold standard. For the last 10, 15 years, to me, you guys have produced what most people would consider the gold standard, the most referenced document in the world when it comes to application security. So it's a great document, constantly evolving, and it lists the 10 most significant vulnerabilities at that particular point in time that people should be cognizant of and be aware of and try to avoid. So when you put this document out, how do you expect or hope that it's going to be used? Right? There's different user communities. There's developers, that are writing code. There's people like us that are testing applications on their behalf, and letting them know whether we found anything wrong. And there's management, that might go down and talk to a product lead or to an application security lead. What's your expectation? You're the one who produces this document. Who do you think is using it, and how do you want them to use it?
Honestly, 15 years ago, it was application security teams, and they were telling, not asking, they were telling developers how to do things. And quite frankly, I think that was a bit of a fail. Over time, the audience hasn't, like the actual how it gets used really hasn't been changed. But I think people are actually aware of it now. And so it succeeded at being an awareness document, but also it gets then adopted as the standard. It's not a standard. When I wrote the OWASP Top 10 2007, I put it to the frontispiece piece. This is not a standard. Please don't use it as such. It's an awareness piece. And I've been very consistent about that for a long time. However, people, because it's so approachable, it's only theoretically 10 things, although there's 43 of them in there. People think that's all I need to do, but it's not. It's the very start of your journey. So if you are starting your journey, it's a great start. But the reality is they should use the application security verification standard, which is the other one that I work on. That's much more developer focused. It's built around the concept of testing. And so you can use it from the very word go, from sprint planning sessions where you're saying, these are the constraints I need to think about from a security perspective, or these are the functional issues that I need to consider. The ASVS can help guide you. But the ASVS itself, there's a lot of things in there. It can be overwhelming. And so if you are starting out, the OWASP Top 10 is probably a better choice. But if you're on the journey, you should probably stop using it and start the ASVS level 1 and then work up. Yeah,
I like the word that you used, approachable. That idea of 10 things, people can wrap their arms around that and really kind of understand what they need to concentrate on. When we spoke in prior, I think you used the term, the OWASP Top 10 are things which we're avoiding. And when you look at the ASVS, right, which is another companion document or another great document that OWASP produces that you have some involvement in, is that kind of the opposite of that? Is that the list of things you should do? So yes, one is don't do and one is do?
Absolutely. Every single thing in the ASVS is written as a positive control. And so it tells you what to do. It's designed to be forked, and so we make it very easily available on GitHub. You can pull it down and change it to your own heart's content. If you don't do web services, you can remove that chapter altogether. If you do, for example, GraphQL, you don't need to consider SQL injection, for example. You need to think about ORM injection, for instance. You can strip things out, put things in, and change it around. The OWASP Top 10, you're going to take it. And so the OWASP Top 10 bundles like things together, like the authentication. We have over 80 things in the authentication chapter. I think in the ASVS, we only have one page of 300 words in the OWASP Top 10. Just communicating the basics of like what multi-factor authentication is and whether or not you need it. It's impossible in the OWASP Top 10. Whereas in the ASVS, we actually give you the ability, if you don't want to do two-factor authentication, just don't do that two-factor authentication section and you're done. Move on.
So in terms of, is there a way beyond the approachability, is there another set of constructs or context that you would say would be proper use? So as an example, would you say that, because your application is of a high risk nature, you should use X, or a specific use case? Maybe it's processing credit card data, or maybe it's processing, some other sensitive PII or something of that nature, or something about the application architecture. Are there other, beyond just that approachability and, hey, I'm new to this, are there other particular, contexts when you would recommend to somebody, to use one or the other?
Yep, if you're doing applications that can kill people or run the economy, you should absolutely not be using the OWASP top 10. You absolutely need to start with the ASVS level 2 and work your way up. If you're doing command and control software for the military, you actually have to use level 3. That's what it's designed for. It has a level of paranoia that is built in. It assumes bad code. It assumes Easter eggs. It assumes that people will attack your memory, things that just don't happen for most apps. We care about it very deeply at level 3. If you're doing medical device software that needs to be resilient, you should do level 3 selectively, because there are areas where you need to be very, very cognizant of, if your software fails because of a security issue, you're going to kill people. That is not the OWASP top 10. It's never been the OWASP top 10. The ASVS has been that level for some time. And the level of paranoia in level 3 is for those high-level those high-level software. Most software, though, is level 2. Banking software, even the stuff that runs like national economies. If you can, for example, recently we had, due to the coronavirus, the stock market crash, they had a reset where they literally paused the stock market for an hour. That would still probably be a level 2 application, because it's got this inbuilt process that slows things down, even though there's high frequency trading happening in the background worth trillions of dollars. The reality is the market can cope with that. And so maybe level 2 is still appropriate for those.
Gotcha. So quick question for you. So, I know that there's some folks that are OWASP contributors are big threat modeling, risk assessment fans, and some are less so. Yes. I think you fall on the more a believer in it. Would that be something? What does that say?
This is the OWASP Cornucopias card set, signed by Colin Watson, who's one of the guys really heavily involved in the OWASP threat modeling community. And I would highly recommend Cornucopia.
Where do I get one?
You go to our website and there should be a merch store, and you can buy them for, I believe, $10. I actually have another copy here, which is made by another company, but this is my favorite copy because it's signed by Colin. And it's actually got my name in it a couple of times, which is fantastic. But it's used by developers as part of a game. So effectively, you start thinking about, oh, we're doing crypto today. Here are the crypto cards. Does this apply to my particular problem today? And these are related back to ASVS sections. And so
that's kind of cool.
You then pin, or this is what I try to do, you pin this to the story to say, I need to deal with this. This is the test I need to write.
Oh, that's pretty cool. All right, so this now I'm jealous. Now I want to set. All right, so I got to go and buy those. In fact, I was so interested in seeing those, I navigated away from my script here, so I got to navigate back. All right, and then so question for you. So we talked about the idea of developers using this. One of the things with the testing, right, is that the OWASP Top 10 is a fully pen testable, fully dynamic application security testable framework. And one of the things which has been very good is some very good tools that are out there have I'll loosely use the term integrated, yours and cross-reference your stuff. So something like Burp or something like Burp Suite, which is a great, ridiculously low-priced product, for value is an amazing product. App Spider we use. Even the Secure Controls Framework, right, is now actually listing your stuff there and cross-referencing it to other controls. Thoughts on that integration and where that might be going. And it does, I think, drive some people to use the OWASP Top 10 from a testing perspective, because it's just easier because the tools are there. It'd be great if the tools were ASVS enabled as well.
Yeah, so the ASVS is actually available in JSON format, so we're easily consumable by tools. So it's a little surprising that we're not more consumed by tools, because we make it actually easier to consume the ASVS than the top 10. And realistically, for things like Burp and Zap and other tools, because we're more granular, you can be a little bit more specific about what the ASVS issue is. And therefore, you can fork the ASVS and say, hey, we're not going to deal with 200 of these things because we can't test for it. And here's the ones we do care about. And therefore, you can work on it. What I'd probably suggest is the ASVS level 1 is entirely pen testable. It's also completely integration testable. So from a developer perspective, everything on level 1 can be integration tested using Selenium or whatever your favorite framework is. And so I would highly recommend people look at level 1 as the new testing checklist, because it is so granular and it's easy to fork, and it's consumable by machine technology.
Yeah, that's interesting. And that seems to, start to align with a shift that we're seeing, from a testing perspective, where people are starting to talk about, don't give me a report at the end of the test, put stuff into Jira for me, right?
Yes.
Open up tickets. Is that kind of the way that you're seeing things going in that more CI/CD, if you're doing like a level 1 test,
Yep.
that and they're going directly into Jira and directly into a story?
Yeah. The most advanced organizations will actually use something like the ASVs to drive the test cases. So every time they do a build, they automatically test. They don't have to do a pen test. They automatically test the application for this particular issue. The next generation of people along who aren't quite there yet are looking for that integration. They're using vulnerability managers who, when they get a new finding from a tool or whatever the case may be, they actually do a level of deduplication into something like Jira or GitHub issues or whatever. Because if a tool runs a scan once a day and it just reports the same problem day after day after day, 365 days later, you've got 365 dupe tickets. So you do need that level of, care. I am seeing that. And so there are platforms like ThreadFix and others that will actually do that deduplication for you. The old-fashioned way is to get a PDF report, and I wish we'd stop doing it because developers don't read them. They just don't.
So you guys produce some awesome content at OWASP, the application security verification standard we've already talked about. You also have the mobile application security verification standard. You've got the IoT top 10 amongst others. Talk a little bit about where both the OWASP top 10 are going and how they may or may not integrate with some of these other great forms of guidance that you guys put out at OWASP.
Sure. So the OWASP top 10, because it's an awareness piece, we want to make people aware of the other standards. So we do link to the testing guide. We do link to the ASVs, the proactive controls. So if today, I would have probably have suggested it would have been lovely for OWASP to have started with the proactive controls back in 2003. But we're here. The OWASP top 10 is an awareness piece and it concentrates on the negative. And so it's our job to use that fame and glory to actually promote these other standards, like the testing guide.
I thought it was to get rich and famous.
That hasn't happened.
No. Sorry about that.
I am sort of somewhat.
Are you saying that's? Listen, I recognize that picture behind you. It's one of my favorite. I told you this when we started that I have socks with that same picture on it. Are you saying that's not the original behind you?
No, that was me when I was having a date night with my wife, and there was alcohol involved, so it's better than it would have otherwise been.
Did you actually paint that?
Yeah.
Yeah. Congratulations. That looks pretty darn good from here.
As I said, there was alcohol involved. Within the OWASP community, I think I'm moderately well known. However, the reality is I don't get recognized at the supermarket. So fame and glory, being rich, no, it hasn't happened that way. But it's been good for my career, let's put it that way. But no, I mean, getting back to the actual problem, the OWASP top 10 points at these other things that made me more relevant. And so it's our job within the 300 words for each of the sections to actually point out, this is the problem, these are the people who might do it to you, here's some examples of people have been doing it to others, and roughly what you might want to do about it. And generally that points off to one of those other things, like, for example, the ASVs or the testing guide or the mobile application security verification standard. So the interlinking will continue. And as far as I'm concerned, standards should try to interlink, because if you have, for example, ISO 27002 says you must have an 8-character password, blah, 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 ridiculous password complexity. And then NIST says, that makes no sense, do it this way. Which one do you comply with? And so at OWASP in the top 10 in the ASVS, we chose the NIST pathway because it's evidence-based. And we'll continue to align ourselves with other standards so that we don't have our own special version of it. If there's nothing in the marketplace that says do it this way because there's no data on it, we will of course set some sort of standard, but there's no reason for us to have our own password complexity rules. And so we do like interlinking with other standards where they are relevant.
Yeah, one of the problems you have, of course, is they have to be friendly. So PCI is an example. They have their own software standard. It'd be great if that was cross-referenced to ASVS, but they've got to work with you for that, right?
Yeah. So, funny story. Back in 2007, when I did the OWASP Top 10 2007, I wrote in the foreword, please don't use this as a standard. And then next year, the PCI Council used it as a standard. And so it's both a mixture of the 2004 and 2007 versions. And if they come to us, we could have come up with a much better section 6.5 than the one they had, but they didn't. And only member organizations can contribute to the PCI standards. Same with ISO. If you're not part of the national bodies from a particular country. So for example, I live in the US now, I'm Australian. If I was to work with ISO, I would have to work with the Australian standards body for me to contribute to ISO standards. Yet ISO 27034 or the cloud one, I could provide them a lot of interesting advice. I get backhanded copies from people who are interested. I can't deliberately contribute to that particular standard, and I find that disappointing. I'd really like to help them produce a better standard.
And you can't participate because you're not a U.S. citizen? Is that what the reason is?
If I was to be invited, it would be via the US. Sorry, not the United States. It would be from the Australian government, and for that, I would have to be involved with the Australian government's standard-setting body, and that's possible. So Australian standards exist, and there are people who participate there who are my friends. And I'm sure that if I asked around enough, I'd find out who of my friends is on the US version at ANSI. But the reality is, unless you're actually a citizen of the country, you can't participate in the one you live in right now. You have to participate in the one you're the citizen of.
That's interesting. I didn't know that.
It's a bit more convoluted than it should be.
Gotcha. Now so you have maintained a pattern of every 3 to 4 years. You've been updating the OWASP Top 10. I think the most recent one is 2017. That implies that we're probably coming up with a new one pretty soon?
Yes, we are working on it now. We've been meeting since last year. Progress has been a bit slow because of the coronavirus, and our original plan to release at AppSec USA or AppSec in San Francisco later this year has been a little delayed. And I think I'll use the time, at the moment I'm between jobs, I'll use this time to actually push it forward. We've got to do data collection and analysis. I really want us to get it done and get it done in 2020. I still think we can release it in 2020. So do look out for data collection, assistance. Like we'll be putting that onto Twitter very shortly. We want to get the analysis and actual publication done this time. But unlike last time, we do not want to release it on Thanksgiving week. That was terrible. We couldn't get any media. We couldn't get any traction with anybody. And I think we missed the boat. So I think October has to be the last possible month for us to release it. It would be ideal to release it in September. But with coronavirus, it makes it a bit trickier.
Yeah, I think this year is going to be a little bit hard. I think most news stories are going to struggle for some effort until this gets a little bit further along. So, and from your perspective, will we see any difference in terms of your top 10 and the way that you integrate with ASVS?
I think we'll do more of the same in that way, but this time around, last time we had 43 CWEs, and that's probably 33 too many. I really want us to either focus in on a category. So for example, the crypto category is like 327 or something. It'd be ideal for us to focus in on a category. So we only have one CWE per page. We still probably need to stick to the 1 page per item. But integrating with other standards, integrating with other elements that are actually out there. For example, if we end up finding out that business logic flaws is a big deal, maybe we'll find someone who's doing some work in that area and we can reference them. But we need to make sure it's fresh. We need to make sure that it's not self-referential. One of the criticisms of the OWASP Top 10 is that it looks like the one that was last time, and that looks like the one before that. And the reality is that if everyone uses the OWASP Top 10 as a standard, that's what people find, and that's the methodology the OWASP Top 10 uses to create itself. So it'll
Plus,
always look like that.
it's not your fault that the developers haven't learned yet. I mean,
Yes.
you've been telling them about injection problems for a decade, and we still have them. I mean, what are you going to do? Not report what the most important thing is that you're seeing?
So this is, I think, an area that we need to work on. Back in the old days, it was very easy to blame developers who didn't know something, but I've never met a developer who didn't want to know how to secure software.
Mm-hmm.
They have pride in the work that they do. I think we need to do a better job as a community working with the frameworks. If they produce frameworks that are by default, the easiest way to do something is not shoot yourself in the foot. Like, for example, why is there any PHP functions at all that are SQL injectable? It could be removed. It could be removed. It should be saying in PHP 8, MySQL real query will not exist. All software that uses that function will not work. You have 2 years. It will get people on the road. And that's what we need to do. We need to get frameworks to start saying, hey, this is not okay. This is a common source of things. Let's fix the bug class. And we do that in frameworks. I don't like the idea that we're blaming developers for not understanding something they didn't know and then not protecting themselves. I do think frameworks have a higher standard. They need to come up. That's how CISO got fixed. That's how it got out of the OWASP top 10. The correct place to fix that was in frameworks. Frameworks put CISO protection in, problem solved.
Yeah. And well, I think the other thing too, in fairness to developers, is we also have to understand that as business leaders and organizations that are running the business, that we have to give people the time, energy, and effort necessary to actually prioritize security, right? Move security left. I mean, it's not that they don't know what to do. It's that they've got so many other pressures to get, features out, right, to serve the business. And security tends to come a little bit later in the process, where it really needs to come a little bit earlier in the process.
Exactly. And so, I mean, GraphQL, for example, there was a really good talk I watched a little while ago on all the different ways you could attack it. And it's like, this is like 2001 again. Like everything that we learned back then about SQL injection, I would have hoped that GraphQL would have not had some of those problems. They fixed the most obvious ones, but then they reintroduced the ones we already knew how to solve. It's like, oh, really?
One step forward, 2 steps back, right?
Yeah, I mean, it has like this thing where it actually tells you the schema and actually, the sorts of things you might be able to do. Why?
All right. So you've hit everything on my list quite well, I would say as well. Anything else that you think we should touch on with regards to the top 10?
Yeah, we're obviously trying to build the 2020 version. I'd love to get data contributions. At the end of the day, this is how we make the OWASP top 10 better and more relevant. Last time we had data from 43 firms. We had data from bug bounties. We had data from software like static code analysis tools. In fact, we got so much data from them, it almost overwhelmed the entire data, and we had to figure out how to normalize that. But fundamentally, the data that we get and the quality of that data really helps build a better OWASP Top 10 2020. So if you do have data, please help contribute. Go to the OWASP Top 10 Twitter handle or mine. I will retweet it. And my DMs are open. Please just ask us, how do we contribute? We'll be putting it out there in the next couple of weeks, how to actually submit the form, what we're looking for, and what sort of data quality we're looking for. If it's hand constructed, we need to know that. If it's something from your internal systems and you need to massage the data to get rid of identifying information, let us help you with that. We would like the data to be public. We are thinking about having anonymous contributors, but obviously then that means you might need to hide who you are and things like that. Help us understand how we can help you give us the data. We would rather have the data than to not have the data because you're concerned about identification. And the last part is, please give us feedback. When you see drafts, give us feedback.
And you guys recently moved to, I know the site just recently evolved completely, and you've moved everything to GitHub, right?
Yes. So the actual website for the OWASP organization, it was on MediaWiki for a long time, and it had a lot of craft, and it was difficult to find things. The search engine didn't really find much. But people have hard links into it, and it was a disturbing thing for everyone, including us. I know Torsten, one of our co-leaders, he actually is busy working on it at the moment and has had improvements in the last week since we last spoke. And so I'm hopeful the work he's putting into there will actually make it easier for us to actually have translations and all those things up. At the moment, it's a bit rough, and that's because we're translating hundreds of thousands of pages from an old mechanism to maybe 1,000 pages in the new. There's all GitHub pages.
Gotcha. And really all of the projects have been migrated over to the new, and just for everyone listening, it's, OWASP.org is still where we're going to find all this wonderful content, correct?
That's correct. But not every project's there yet.
Okay.
Active projects need to do what we did, or what Torsten did, and actually help with the migration of their pages.
Gotcha. Okay. Anything else you want to touch based on?
Other than that, if anyone's interested in collaborating on standards, I'm very interested in hearing from other standard setters. If you are working on a standard that's relevant to OWASP, web application security, or information security in general, please do touch base. We often have a very good relationship with some folks. We're actually working on some collaborations with others, and we want to see where they can go.
Yeah, it would be great to see some maps between, like I said, something like the new PCI standard and what you guys are doing. So yeah, anyone that would be producing those maps, it would be great, to have them be part of the project.
Yeah, sure.
Cool. So I always like to close with two questions. One is fun. An amazing or horrible CISO. It could be an application security person if you want. It could be a fictional character. It could be a real life person. Who would either make a amazing or horrible CISO and why?
Okay, so I think we'll go with horrible CISO because it's easier. I actually would nominate Fry from Futurama because he always says, here's take my money. You don't want to be led that easily as a CISO. You need to have a philosophy and a way of thinking about, conceptual integrity and make your decisions around that particular choice every time. Not because someone's yelling at you, not because it's fashionable, not because a tool vendor took you to lunch. It's really important to make. Well, it happens. We know that happens, right?
Oh, I know that particular one resonates with me so strongly. Or the guy whose security strategy is driven by the Gartner Magic Quadrant reports. It's like I got one of them, and I got one of them, and I got no. This is not going to work.
Yeah.
So yeah, I agree with you. Now you also said when we were talking earlier, you said something that I thought was also interesting. Is you also differentiated that a CISO may or may not be a good or a bad CISO, also depending upon where you are in an organization. And I think you used the example of someone going through a transformation. So, could you touch on that?
Yeah, so there are CISOs who are going to be basically just keeping the lights on. They need to have a steady hand, be the voice of calm, and actually just make sure the basics are done. And that's fine. But if you're the sort of CISO who's being brought in for a transformation to enable secure business and take the organization to the next level, you are a different type of CISO, and you need to be proactive, and you need to have that. You need to have a bit of a vision about where you want to take it and how it can actually work. To a certain degree, the best way to create the future is to invent it, and that doesn't mean necessarily following everybody else. CISOs, they can change the culture within an organization. And if you're the sort of organization that doesn't like applying patches and whatnot, you're going to get broken into someday. But that doesn't really change whether or not you're going to be a leading organization in the future. I've worked on a number of big projects over the years where we have changed the future. Like one platform, we did corporate internet banking, and if you had $2 billion in the bank, you could transfer $2 billion in the bank. You could just do it, and we did it securely. It changed the nature of payments in Australia. And it literally, it began real-time payments in Australia 15 years ago. Mm-hmm. And so instead of waiting 2 or 3 days and getting our transactions like payroll, it used to be delivered on 9-track tape. Right. We could do that immediately. And it saved companies a fortune. And it actually got us market share. And that was really important. That's a transformation role. You cannot say, I'm going to implement such and such a banking solution from 3 years ago and call that transformation. You need to think about what it is the business really wants to achieve. There are CISOs who are good for that, and there are CISOs who are a very steady hand. And I think there's two different types.
Yeah, and that's actually very interesting because it ties into a conversation I had with a gentleman he was talking about CIOs. And then we said, well, it applies to CISOs as well. And he kind of used a similar analogy to you, and he said that, if you have a CIO who loves technology, that person might be able to keep those lights on and do that. But if he loves the business, he can help you transform. So I think to your point, right, it's the same kind of analogy. You need that CISO to love the business as much as he loves a tool and technology.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. One of my favorite CISOs was a gentleman by the name of Gary Burgess, who's transformed a couple of banks in Australia in his time, and he actually introduced a FPOS device in Australia. And effectively, it allows you to do things like splitting tips, payments, licenses, renewals, everything. And it's literally like a little tiny smart pad that is a wireless FPOS controller. And we're talking about the days when when you came to a store, you may or may not have an EMV terminal, whereas that's universal today. But this is essentially the next generation of FPOS devices. And the only equivalents I can think of today, and it's still not quite that advanced, is the ones that you see occasionally, like with Square and whatnot.
Yeah.
This was 12 years ago.
Right.
So those sorts of people who can take you to the next level can transform your business. And I think, when you find them, look after them.
Yeah. And I think it's also recognize who you are as a business. That person that has that ability to solve security challenges of that nature that will help you transform a company. If you don't need that skill set and you just need a guy to keep the lights on, hire that, because that guy's going to cost you a lot, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
But if you need someone to transform you, don't hire the guy that's going to keep the lights on.
Yes.
So on the my last question is, every day, all day, you're talking about technology and security like we are. This podcast is listened to by both information security people and people that are on the business side, trying to learn that. What do you think would be an interesting topic for a future episode?
Bug class solving. I think at the end of the day, if we're just stamping like whack-a-mole on this bug, that bug, if we look back at the Zoom issue, that's an IDOR. That's not a bug that is unknown, but solving IDORs, solving memory issues, solving business logic flaws automatically. Formal methods is a way of solving some of those things, but how do you do that with all this legacy code hanging around when every single piece of code in existence is legacy code? I would like to hear from someone who's actually going to do that intersection between the business and technology to actually understand, how do we solve some of these bug class issues? Is it a thing where we start to remove liability from firms who produce that buggy software? Is it something that we start to think more about really taking application security from professional amateurs, like people like myself who have been doing it for a long time, to people who actually understand why this happens and then fixing it so it never happens again? I think we should stop paying for things that we should know should not happen.
Is that something that's the realm of AI and machine learning? Is that something that's the realm of the people that develop the developer tools? Is that the Microsoft Visual Studio folks? I mean, how would you go about doing that? Because that sounds like a pretty tall mountain.
It is a mountain, and in fact, the only way to solve some of this stuff is to isolate it into a domain and then fix that domain. I think it is actually someone like the compiler manufacturers working with the Buns, Hoostrops of the world, the people who can actually create these languages and the frameworks, sitting in a room saying, how do we actually solve this? Because we now have some AI tools that can say, well, that looks bad. Otherwise, we have to wait for general AI. And if we're waiting for general AI, we may be waiting for a very long time. And so then how do we scale developers to get the answers they need? How do we make secure, like if you've got a application security team with 5 people on it and they're looking after 1,500 apps, they are not looking at the source code.
Right.
How do we scale it? And the answer is it has to be scalable. To my mind, that means frameworks, languages, and compilers.
Yep, I would agree. And I think actually now is, unfortunately, probably a really critical time for that to be happening, before we put out, whatever the insane number we're talking about, 100 billion IoT devices. I mean, because all of them have firmware on it. And a lot of the, they haven't moved security left. And, if we let too many of these devices out there, you're going to be talking about a legacy code problem that has some pretty significant implications.
So there was talk, this again comes back to the intersection between business and regulation. There was talk a few years ago that if you can't update the IoT device, it can only live for like 18 months and then it dies. And so if you want to have a device that's not disposable, like a car, then it needs to be updatable. and updatable without the user's intervention.
Yep.
And I think that goes for even things like children's toys, like, you know, that they had this Barbie doll that listened to kids' conversations and then decided what it was going to do in the future. If it's not updatable, kill it. As far as I'm concerned, we need to have that conversation between the businesses and the technologists to be able to come up with the frameworks that allow us to move on. You know, as we get towards self-driving cars, you'll get to a situation where this generation of self-driving car might accidentally kill people because it doesn't know anything better. And unless it's updatable, is that okay? And if the answer is no, then it needs to be updatable. And so I think a lot of the things in IoT in particular, we really need to have that legal regulatory framework around what is an acceptable IoT device. It's the same as you can't plug things into the wall unless they're got some sort of regulatory approval.
Right, UL or something of that nature. Yep.
Yeah, there needs to be something along those lines with what does the industry agree is an acceptable way of keeping IoT safe. And when it comes to things like power grids, things like, for example, you know, network devices and whatnot, something that runs this entire neighborhood's power might be built to a higher and more stringent level than, say, for example, this, you know, network device. But I think the fundamental philosophy of it should be, if it's not updatable, kill it.
Yep.
And therefore, you know, we know it's a disposable thing, therefore it should be cheaper.
Right.
If you want a more expensive thing, it's updatable.
Right. And you listen, I mean, the good news is that guidance is getting out there. I know Daniel Miesler, right, runs the IoT Top 10, and I know that's one of the IoT Top 10 things that he's had, and I've heard him talk extensively about that. You know, you're starting to see that creep into things like California SB 327 and NIST 8228 as well. So, yeah, I think you're right. I mean, I think the good news is that we're getting out in front of it.
Yep.
I just think that we're not quite as in front of it as it would be ideal, but better a little late than never. So before we say goodbye, how can folks get in contact with you?
The easiest way is via Twitter. I've got open DMs. I'm just VanderAJ there. If they want to email me, vanderaj@owasp.org. Other than that, I've been on the internet since 1989. Just search for my name.
Like you said, you're famous, just not rich and famous, and you know, you're not getting that table at Spago's on Friday nights, right?
That's not happening.
Andrew, thank you so much for coming on, and Andrew is as gracious as can be, because we got 45 minutes into our last interview and I realized that I hadn't hit record. So an extra special thanks to Andrew.
No worries. Thank you. Talk soon.